All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Susan, for that nice introduction. And um, today we're going to talk a little bit about practice. Now, given the limited amount of time, my primary goal is to get you thinking a little deeper about practice. I know for me personally, as I think back to when I was a teacher, I did practice, but I didn't really put a lot of thought into it. And we're really learning is in order for practice to really be effective and do it, there has to be some very careful and purposeful thinking going into play. So today I'm going to kind of get you thinking about practice, all subject areas. You're probably going to hear a little bit more math come out of me because that's my background. So some of you that are coming in, there is a link. Susan, maybe you want to drop it back in the chat again. A link. Oh, there it is. There's a link with the materials. And I just want to just a little background. I'm a former special ed and general ed math teacher from middle school and high school. Currently, I'm at Penn State University, but way back in the day when Dr. Thompson and I were doing a lot of work together, I was in Clemson, South Carolina at Clemson University. So if you're a Gamecock fan, don't hold that against me. All right. So with that said, I'm gonna share my screen. Before I share my screen, feel free to put a question in the chat. I'll try to monitor that. Susan will help me if I um, miss it, or you can unmute. It's kind of a small group. But in that resources, you'll see the materials, the PowerPoint handout, as well as a lot of other resources in terms of uh, going a little deeper. Obviously, in 45 minutes, I don't have a lot of time to go in depth, but we'll give you some resources and some things to think about. So let me share my screen and share screen. All right, Dr. Thomas, can you confirm that you are seeing my PowerPoint
I
slide?
can see it.
All right, I always have to get confirmation. I talked for 15 minutes a couple weeks back with my blue screen window in the background. All right, so what we're going to focus on today is practice. And sort of as you're thinking about this practice, what I want you to think about is it's what we do after the instruction. So once we've given the kids the instruction and we want them to begin to think about practice, we're going to talk about the different purposes of practice and then the types of practice that are going to align with it. So, big picture today is we have to make sure that the activity that we're doing for practice matches the purpose of practice. Now, if you've seen me before in some of the sessions that I've done, um, I sort of call everything HIT, high intensity instructional technique. So it's taking things we're kind of sort of doing and being a little bit more purposeful with it. Now, before I get started, I always like to start with the learners. So obviously, there's a lot of special ed teachers in this afternoon session. There's a lot of co-teachers, there's directors, curriculum folks. There's a nice mix of folks, but I like to start with the learners. And I like to go outside of the labels that we have for learners. The whole idea of LD, learning support, behavioral support, autism, gifted, talented. Those labels are important for some things. What they're not really important for is instructional decisions. So when you start thinking about the types of learners we have, we really have two types of learners. We have strategic, and strategic learners, because of their learner characteristics, they're able to maximize the benefit of whatever the activity is, whether it's an instructional activity, peer activity, or practice, because they regulate their learning, they know when they're confused, they are able to recognize when they're confused, and they will seek help. And when they seek that help, they can actually tell you where they're having issues, which allows us to help them. So you have strategic learners, and I kind of Strategic learners are going to adapt and make things work for them. But there's this other group of learners which are non-strategic, and this is not dependent on disability. So we have uh, kids with IEPs that are very strategic learners, and we have kids without IEPs that are non-strategic learners, and there's a mix there. But when you look at the learner characteristics, those are the things that really are important for when we start to design our activities. And non-strategic learners, their learner characteristics create some challenges in their learning. Number one, they don't regulate very well, so they don't know when they're having a problem. They often don't ask for help. And when they are asked about what is confusing, they often cannot tell the teacher, or they'll tell things like, "I don't understand everything." So these characteristics mean they don't really maximize activities to their benefit. So they're kind of at the whim of the activity. So in order to take things and make them more effective, we have to pay attention to their learner characteristics. So a good example in practice is a strategic learner is likely not going to practice everything wrong. They may practice it wrong once, but then they realize they're practicing it wrong and they either ask for help or they self-correct. Where a non-strategic learner, they don't even know if they're right or wrong. They're just practicing. And that can lead to practicing incorrectly multiple times. And when that happens, then they're learning it. The problem is they're learning it wrong. But what we're going to kind of zero in today is one of the big challenges with non-strategic learners is their executive functioning. So their working memory, short-term memory, because this is really where practice comes into play. So I kind of like to use this figure to kind of to frame what we're going to talk about. But learning is has two parts to it, really. There's the initial phase when you're trying to learn something new, and then there's the back end phase or the retention part when they're trying to remember it. And all of those are important to learning, whether you're learning something new or you're trying to remember something. Some subject areas are more susceptible to retention issues. I think math and foreign language are very problematic when you're not able to remember things. But when you look at here at the diagram, the front part of learning is going to really be focused on the sensory register and then the working short-term memory. So the sensory registry is how you take in information. So this is when kids are learning something the first time. So it could be a teacher-led instruction, systematic and explicit. It could be with partners. It could be an inquiry-based lesson. There's various ways kids take in information. But the first thing that happens is they take information in, and they're primarily doing this through hearing and seeing. Now, if they're using some type of manipulatives, or there's a science experiment, or they're doing some other things, other senses are coming into play. But that's how they're taking in the information. And that happens in a couple of seconds. But once they take it in, it goes into the short-term working memory part of the brain. And this is where the initial learning is really happening. Kids are grappling with this information. They're trying to make sense of it. They're trying to link it to previously learned information. They're trying to make connections, maybe to their personal life, their lives outside of school, or teachers are trying to make the connections. But this is when they're grappling with it. So in this early stage of learning or acquisition, once there starts to become some practice. So this is when the teacher is kind of giving the kids opportunities to practice. So if you think about when they're first practicing something, and this is anything, so it could be in math, which is practice is most prominent, but reading or writing, and all these other subject areas. When they first are trying to apply what they're learning in this first stage of practice, the primary goal is to acquire it. So in that initial phase, their practice is very slow. They make a lot of errors and they need a lot of support. And this, as they practice more, they grapple with more, they start to transfer the information, or they're starting to learn it. They're starting to become more confident. They are not making as many errors. They don't need as much support. They're starting to become proficient. So it is that point that the information that they're learning is now going to move out of the short-term working memory into the long-term memory. So practice that is going to occur early in the initial acquisition needs to be very much focused on a specific outcome, so somewhat narrow. You need a lot of guidance and you need immediate and corrective feedback. And that is where teachers can begin to see the misconceptions, can try to work around errors that kids are making so they're not continuing to make it. But the big part is the fading teacher support. So thinking initially, you're providing a lot of support to kids. As they begin to grapple with it, you start to fade away. So this is when they're starting to become more independent, or they're beginning to acquire the concept or skill of whatever you're teaching. So this is now we're moving out of the initial acquisition phase, and this is going to be important when we start talking about the practice that goes with each of these phases as they're acquiring the skill. Now, obviously, we shoot for 100%, but kids are going to have a continuum of how much they acquire. Sometimes I like to remind teachers going from 0 to 50 is a lot. Obviously, it's not enough for some for what we're looking for, but 0 to 50 is a lot. But as they are acquiring the skill, we're fading all the supports. So now they're becoming a little bit more independent. So now we're kind of entering the second part of learning, which is when the information is now learned. So that's the word we use is learned. The fancy word for this is called encoding. So when kids learn something in any subject area, once it's been learned, it's become encoded. And it's encoded in the long-term memory part of the brain. So these are actually different parts of the brain now that are working. So when kids first are learning something, they're heavily using their working memory and their short-term memory. As they acquire it and are learning it, they start to move it and store it. So it is this interaction between working memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory is where the practice can strengthen things. So what we're learning is practice to help kids acquire something needs to look different than the practice to help maintain it. And that's where we're going to kind of get into things today. Now, there are some very specific retention strategies, and I do a lot of work in this area, but the retention strategies all have a specific mechanism that is designed into the activity that forces the retrieval. And I focus on slot space learning over time, interleaving practice, and practice test recall, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But for now, what I want you to start thinking about is when you're working with your kids, think about that initial learning phase where they're starting to learn it for the first time and grapple with it. As they practice a little bit more, think of a progression. As they're grappling with it, they start to become more independent, more confident, more proficient, if you will. And that information is now starting to be encoded and learned. So the practice that we do must align with the purposes. So if the purpose is for initial acquisition, we got to make some considerations for specific types of practice or versus retention. So as we're thinking about kind of that framework, let's start talking about practice. So obviously today's session is leveraging more intensive practice. So what does that exactly mean? Well, in order to kind of get to the more intensive practice, we have to think about traditional practice. And a lot of times traditional practice kind of is in a massed format where they're just doing the same thing over and over. Think about spelling words, math problems, and it's sort of creating this rote learning where they're doing a whole bunch of that practice and then they learn it. Cramming is another kind of practice. A lot of strategic learners are actually very good at cramming. So they cram the night before a test and they come in and it looks like they've learned it. The problem is all of those lead to short-term gains with rapid forgetting. And you all, if you're a teacher, you've experienced this probably today if you were with kids. So in today's lesson, you're teaching and something in the lesson comes up from a month ago or the previous chapter. And you do your classic teaching like, "Oh, hey guys, remember we did this last chapter." And in unison, almost all of the kids say, "No, I don't remember that. I don't remember it." And you're like, "What? Come on, we did it. Don't you remember we did this? You guys could do it." And then they double down on the don't remember. And you know what I'm going to say next? They double down and say, "You did not teach us this," right? Like at the beginning of the school year when you're trying to review stuff from the previous year, that teacher from the previous year taught them nothing. So you're trying to like bring it, so you start giving them clues, like, remember we did this, remember this, and then a whole lot of the kids go, oh, now I remember. So that is this rapid forgetting. The phrase I like to use is instead of forgetting, is they couldn't access it. So it's there, but they can't access it because of the way they practiced it initially. So this is the problem with traditional practice. Now, certain subject areas are more prone to this. The math, reading, writing, there is a lot of practice involved. Some sciences, there are a lot of practice. So certain subject areas are going to be a little more susceptible to this. But the key is the purpose of practice does not match the practice technique. And that's what we're going to really get into. So I really like to encourage teachers that when they say, hey, we're going to practice this today, that they go one step farther and identify the exact purpose of that practice. Is it initial acquisition? Is it to build fluency? Is it to help remember certain things? So really identifying the purpose. So the power of effective practice, and this is what, like I said, if there's one thing that you leave today's Zoom from with our session today is right there, is that first bullet is we have to do a better job of more clearly and maybe more explicitly matching purpose and technique so that we are able to enhance retention. We got to support retention. I like to tell teachers when kids take tests at the end of the year, it's not really testing what they learned throughout the year. And I know that sounds weird. It's testing what they remember. The other big thing is quality over quantity. We got to really look at the quality of the practice versus the quantity. If we practice too much, that's not necessarily a good thing. An example of that is interleave versus block practice, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is one of the things that we're battling is the forgetting curve. So this is how fast kids forget things. So when we are teaching, we're kind of if I had the a larger, wider screen, here's the forgetting curve. But we're also got to focus on this. So this is the initial learning starting here. They don't know anything. We got to get them up here. Then once they get up here, we got to keep them up there. So this is kind of capturing purposes. Is it to help the kids learn it, or is it to help them um, remember it? So I like this diagram. Now, this diagram came out of a chapter that I wrote with a couple of colleagues, Charlie Hughes, um, and another person, Courtney Dexter. But this is the diagram that I really kind of want to zero us in on for the remainder of our 20 minutes. I'm going to try to leave about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. But when you're thinking about this, you've got your practice techniques here. So these are the different kinds of practice techniques. You have the different purposes, so short term, long term, all these different purposes, and then you have the process. So obviously, as you kind of go from left to right here, we're talking about the initial learning through the retention piece. And you can see is there's different types of practice that we want to set up as kids are going through this progression. So I'm going to start with massed versus distributed. And again, subject areas are kind of important here. I would say math, reading, writing are probably the areas that are most associated with practice, but there's practice in the sciences, there's practice in the social studies. Sometimes it's a little more of the application piece versus a little less, but mass practice is when you're practicing the same skill repeatedly. This is also in math called block practice. So this is when you're practicing a very focused skill or concept repeatedly and intensively in one session. So what that does is it helps you sort of begin to get the skill, acquire it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to maintain it. So you have to do this mass practice combining with this distributed is where you begin to spread it across time. So the intensive practice helps acquire the skill short term. Think of short term. Then the distributing the practice is how you keep it maintained by spreading it across multiple sessions. More is not always better. So example is you're going to practice vocabulary words for 15 minutes per day versus cramming for 2 hours. The 2 hours is this mass. You're going to get a really short-term burst there, but it's not going to be maintained. Where if you just spread it out across time, then you're going to get that practice that strengthens the connections and allows for that information to be accessible longer term. Then there's this idea of cumulative practice, and this is where I'm going to use the word interleave. Now, cumulative practice is what is occurring after the kids have acquired the skill or concept. So the mass distributive helps them acquire it. Once it's acquired, then you have this cumulative piece. So this is where you want to keep revisiting across time in various ways so that we are trying to break the learn and forget cycle. And kids will tell you this right up front. A lot of kids, especially at the younger levels, are kind of brutally honest. So you've taught something, you move on, and then you want to connect the new topic to the previously learned stuff. And you say, hey, remember we did this? And the kids will often go, well, no, why do we have to remember that? That was last chapter. We're on to something new. So the cumulative practice is what we're going to do to help the kids retain it. And this can be something where, you're a chapter test covering both recent as well as some earlier content. So you're interleaving new and previously learned content. So there's never a one and done scenario. So the cumulative practice helps maintain it. But as we go off in cumulative practice, now we're going to get into what is called interleaved. This is something that is I really started to do a lot of work in, and um, it's at least from my perspective, a lot of teachers are, I think teachers understand mass practice, distributed practice, and cumulative practice. I think those are basic kind of terms in the teacher world. What I find is these latter two are the ones where teachers are less familiar with. The first one is interleave. So interleave practice is when you're mixing very dissimilar skills together in the same practice session. So a math example is on one practice, you're going to do a multiplication problem, then you do a division problem, then you do fractions. They're together. So instead of doing all multiplication of fractions in mass practice or doing all division of fractions in mass practice, we're now going to give kids an interleaved opportunity where they're going to have a multiplication problem followed by a division problem together so that this is causing this retrieval of this information. So this is what really promotes what we call durable learning. That is learning that lasts. So the mass practice and the distributed practice give you that initial burst. The cumulative practice kind of helps keep it there, but this interleaved is what helps it become durable across time. Now, once we get here to this piece of learning, and we're confident that kids are remembering and they're discriminating. So interleave also is important because it promotes discrimination. So when kids see two different things side by side in math, two different problems, they can discriminate. But the same thing is in reading. So if you think about teachers, we do a lot of block practice with CVC words. Now, Susan, I'm getting out of my comfort zone here. So if I do this wrong, I'm sure you will correct me. You've got CVC words, and we spend a whole lot of time teaching those. Then we do a VCE word. So one letter changes the entire pronunciation of the word. So we want those kids to see that side by side so they can discriminate. Same with writing letters and writing numbers. So there's the mass practice that gets them to do it, but then they have to see the things together so that they can discriminate. But once we get to this piece, then a whole nother purpose of practice comes into play, and that is this retrieval practice. And this is where I think, at least in mathematics, we don't do this as well as we think we're doing, but also in science and social studies. This is when we want kids to recall previous information without looking it up. And this is, I think, something that is going to continue to be a big challenge for teachers because of our phones. We as a species are beginning to remember less details about things, but remembering where to look them up. So if you think about your own laptops, we take notes and we store it in folders, and there's levels and subfolders and all that kind of stuff. What really is happening is we're creating documents and we can't remember what we put into the documents, but we can remember the 7 levels where we stored them. So I think this is going to become a bigger issue for kids, is helping them recall information without assistance, or what's called free recall. So an example of a free recall activity where you're leveraging some spacing of previous information with this recall is in science. So last month we were learning about photosynthesis. Take a minute and write down everything you can remember about photosynthesis. So what I did in that activity is forcing, so to speak, the kids to recall without any assistance. So that's that free recall. So when you give kids that question, they're going into their long-term memory and they're trying to dig out the information or access it. When they find it, they pull it into their short-term working memory to write it down. And that's creating that recall activity that strengthens the retention. Now, of all the retention strategies, this practice test recall gets very large results in their studies and is used in multiple subject areas from math to science. So tell me what you can remember about photosynthesis. You can insert anything in there. Tell me what you remember about the Pythagorean theorem. Tell me what you remember about how to write a persuasive essay, or what are the elements in the persuasive essay. So what you're doing with this recall is you're constantly giving kids an opportunity where they have to recall information without looking it up. And this is something I think is underutilized by teachers. We will often at this stage, if you say to kids, if you can't remember it, look it up. What we're finding is when you look it up, it's actually not helping retention as much as we think it is because they're not recalling it, they're looking it up. So this is, I think, of the areas, I think these last two are probably the ones that are being underutilized by teachers. Now, if we take our lens and we put on our lens with a special ed teacher and a general ed teacher, and we kind of look at this continuum here, clearly kids with IEPs need a lot of help with retrieval, but they also need a lot more time in the initial practice. So what it ends up being is we have to differentiate a little bit in terms of how much we're giving kids at each of these phases. So when you go back to looking at this piece here, the most important thing that you have to stop and pause before you can even think about anything past this is what is the purpose of practice? In other words, where are the kids in the learning progression? And then the practice activity you give the kids must align with one of these techniques. So kids with that struggle, they tend to need a little bit more time here. But one of the things that happens is we spend too much time here and not enough time on the back end. So this leaves teachers kind of like, well, they could do it when I was there, but now they can't remember it a week or two later. So the key with setting up practice is to really think about the purpose of that practice. All right. So as we're thinking about practice, as you're thinking about practice, there's a couple of resources that I wanted to throw at. The most important takeaway for today is it's not necessarily about more practice, but it's about the better practice in matching the purposes and then aligning the practice with what you want the kids to do. So to give you some additional resources, and I think, are these in the folder that I sent to you? Or that you load. So in the folder, there's this chapter which really digs into a little bit of, more on the practice techniques. It's in the high leverage practices book. But in that chapter, you have the chapter. The front part is about explicit instruction. And then once the explicit instruction in the initial phase, how you do practice lines up there. Then there's these other resources, and this is a phenomenally great website, retrievalpractice.org. I love the website. I go there often, but on this website, there's a lot of free stuff. There's also things that are like books that you have to buy, but the free stuff really covers a lot of the practice, especially at the retrieval, the back end. So this is these practice guides are like 10, 12, 13 pages. They're written for folks, practitioners that are trying to improve the practice that they're giving kids. But this is the one that's on the spaced, distributed or spaced practice. This one is devoted to interleaving in math class. The spaced is all subject areas. The interleaving is a little more specific to mathematics. Then the retrieval practice, that free recall piece I was just talking about, that's that practice guide. And then they also have talked about one with younger kids because I think there's some important differentiation that needs to be made when working with the really young children. So there's that document there. Now there's several other ones. There's metacognitive strategies. There's also an effect size document. But this website gives you a lot of resources for teachers that can help them think about practice in a little bit more purposeful kinds of ways. All right, so with that said, I'm going to unshare my screen if I can find my cursor and open it up to questions that anybody might have related to practice, something they're seeing with their kids. Just FYI, I'm more content savvy on mathematics than I am other subject areas. But I'll open it up if anyone has any questions or comments that they'd like to make. Don't be shy.
Dr. Riccomini, can you talk about in retrieval that stage about correction and feedback? So you're using that, and then you see students are not really coming up with the correct answer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'd be happy to go in a little more detail. So there is a technique, and I'm talking about my cursor is not cooperating. Where's my cursor? All right. So the practice guide on retrievalpractice.org. If there's one thing that you want to dig into after this, I would encourage you to look up practice test retrieval. It's a very specific technique that is designed to help the kids retrieve information, and there's four parts to that strategy. I kind of gave you one. And that is you want to give kids some opportunity to free recall. So that's when you say, hey, write down everything you can remember about, fill in the topic, or think about what you can remember about, fill in the topic. So you're giving them a recall opportunity. Once the recall is done, you then give them feedback. So that feedback can be in the form of a discussion. So you can start asking kids what they recalled. It can be more of a teacher-led, like you should have recalled these three things, or it could be a peer-to-peer or a combination of all of those. So you have your free recall, which is matched with some feedback. The third element is you ask the kids to reflect on their recall. So you ask them, how well did you recall about the topic? Thumbs up, in the middle, thumbs down. So you're trying to get them to regulate their learning. So you've got, as Susan was sort of referencing and prompting me, you've got your recall, but you've got the feedback, a self-rating to work on their metacognitive skills. And then fourth is it has to be in a very low stakes, non-graded activity. If it's graded or low or the kids think it's some kind of high stakes, it actually doesn't work. And I think that's getting into this idea of their anxiety. They don't want to engage. So you got to make it a practice retrieval activity. But that I love doing that in math, but it can be done in just about any subject area. So that those are the four elements. So as you look at the different techniques, you'll begin to see there's elements that you build into the activity to match the purpose of the practice. Yeah, so I have Sharon, is there a timeline after initial learning? That's a really, really good question. And the answer to that is yes. So in the spacing idea, so distributed practice or a spiral that's built into a lot of programs, they kind of take there's a spacing in there, but it's not a purposeful spacing. So the best example is when a math teacher does a warm up, a bell ringer, a do now, a warm up. There's usually three or four problems on the board. Kids come in, they have to do them. Generally, the only criteria for getting on that warm up is that it has to have been previously taught. So it could have been taught yesterday, it could have been taught 5 months ago, 6 months ago. In that spaced research on the spaced retrieval, what they found is there are two windows that are actually really important for retention. The first window is about 28 to 40 days, 42 days after the topic was taught. And the way you determine that spacing is you count every day that ends with a Y. So you're counting calendar days, not school days. So if we were going to do a spaced activity today, I would count back 28 days to 42 days, and I'd look at that window and I'd pull something out of that window that I thought was important for the kids to remember, and then I would revisit it today. So that's the first window, Sharon, 28 to 42 days. And then the second one is about 2 months after that. So in that spaced retrieval practice, the mechanism that helps with retrieval and retention is the spacing in these windows. And that does not happen with most spirals and even most reviews by teachers because that's something we don't really pay attention to. But I hope that answered your question, Sharon. That was a good question. Any other questions? Again, feel free to dump it in the chat or unmute.
While we're waiting, I'm going to post our evaluation form, and this is how you will get your certificate. If you complete the evaluation, then you will be emailed a certificate. So I'll put it in there just so everybody has that link.
Is that something you want me to fill out too, Susan?
Well, we know you would give yourself excellent scores. I'm sure all these people will too, Dr. Riccomini.
It could be a tough crowd. I never know what I'm going to get. But again, in such a brief session, I really wanted to accomplish one thing, and that is practice is way more than just giving kids some activities. It's way more than finding a game. It's way more than just stations or worksheets or Kahoots or IXL or whatever iReady. There's a lot more involved in order for us to make practice more purposeful and more effective. And the first thing is to really think about where along the learning progression are my kids? Is this initial? Is this close to initial? Is this for a test? Or is this retrieval? And it is those considerations that will start to make your practice a little more effective or dialing it into the actual purpose of what you're trying to do. This might be the quietest group of South Carolina teachers I've ever had. And if there's no more questions, I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your afternoon to join me. I don't know what the temperature is in South Carolina, but it's 12 degrees here in Pennsylvania.
Well, we're not that low, but we're pretty cold. Dr. Riccomini, thank you so much. And I just want to remind everybody that Dr. Riccomini will be in South Carolina at the end of March at our MTSS Summit. He will be doing one day on elementary math and one day on secondary math. If you go to the Academic Alliance website, academicalliancesc.org, I don't have the link up right now. You can get information about registering for that. It's free. And we're excited about that. So thank you, Dr. Riccomini, for being with us today. And everyone, please take a minute to fill out the evaluation. If you have ideas you want for future training, there's a place for you to put that on that form, and we'd love to look at that.